Hello, and welcome back to the reading of White Rage, the unspoken truth of our racial divide. If you are just joining, we've been reading this book and we are on chapter 3 right now. If you've been reading along, like I mentioned, chapter 3, we're on page 75, starting with the second paragraph. This chapter right now is talking essentially about the Brown versus Board of Education, separate but equal, and what happened around that judgment. Let's go ahead and jump in. To Southern leaders who had already been readying their political arsenal, the decision in Brown was but a declaration of war. Wilkins later admitted, "My sense of euphoria was a bit naive. Swept away, elevated, exalted, I failed to anticipate the ferocity of the resistance that quickly grew up in the Deep South. There was a cold, clinical cruelty of the response." Traditionally, white Southern resistance to Brown has been captured by the visual images of violence that followed the Supreme Court decision. The horribly mutilated body of Emmett Till, the angry mob of housewives surrounding traumatized Elizabeth Eckford on the first day of school at Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the disturbing Norman Rockwell painting of little pigtailed 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, surrounded by towering National Guardsmen and racial epithets scrawled on the wall as she walked up the steps to desegregate her elementary school in New Orleans. None of that violence would have happened, however, and certainly would not have given the broader societal stamp of approval if the respected elements in white society, governors, legislators, U.S. senators, congressmen, and even more tepidly, the President of the United States, had not condoned complete defiance of and contempt for the Supreme Court and the constitutional provision that its decisions are the law of the land. In the North, where racial segregation was intense, the defiance was subtle but effective. In 1957, for example, Milwaukee's school board insisted intact busing that carried Black children to white schools, kept them isolated in a separate classroom, and then ferried them back home again. The overt, even violent response to Brown did not occur until much later, in the 1970s, most spectacularly in Boston. On the other hand, the Southern states made clear that they were ready for war. The first step was to ensure that only those who felt threatened by Brown could vote. The first step was to ensure that only those who felt threatened by Brown could vote. Ever since the rise of Jim Crow in the 1890s, Southern officials had been vigilant in eviscerating Black across the ballot box. By 1944, in the states of the old Confederacy, only 5% of age-eligible African Americans were registered to vote, which left millions of Blacks politically voiceless. In the late 1940s, the NAACP launched a series of voter registration drives to provide local Southern communities with resources to deal with the tangle of requirements: the poll tax, literacy test, understanding clauses, blocking African American access to the ballot box. But the going was hard, and in places like Mississippi, lethal, with well-coordinated campaigns of racial terrorism leading to the murders of residents aiding the NAACP's efforts. As difficult as voter registration had been before Brown, it became much more so after the ruling. Mississippi reinforced an amendment requiring superior literacy and an ability to understand and interpret the state's constitution. Given that nearly 53% of Mississippi's adult African American population had fewer than 5 years of education, compared with only 10% of whites of the voting age, the emphasis on literacy and interpretation of a complicated legal document, while appearing race neutral, was in fact targeted directly at Black Mississippians. They withheld education from African Americans, but then required education to vote. Even more, state authorities required already registered African Americans to go through the gauntlet of literacy test, understanding clauses, and the whims of registrar scrutiny once again to re-register. That move alone caused the number of Black registered voters in Mississippi to plummet by 2/3. Moreover, the ever-present threat of violence was pervasive, with the full support and sometimes participation of law enforcement. As J.W. Millam, the Mississippian who tortured and murdered 14-year-old Emmett Till, only to be found not guilty in 1955 by a jury of his peers, remarked, "Niggers ain't gonna vote where I live. If they did, they control the government. They ain't gonna go to school with my kids." Statements like that is a reminder that when the oppressors find themselves being faced with the people that they have oppressed, when the people that are violent are faced with the people that they have caused harm to, the instinct is to think that that person is going to do the same thing in response to them, as opposed to just wanting to survive and live. The same sentiment animated officials 110 miles away in the capital of Jackson, who worked tirelessly to reduce the power of the Black vote until in many counties not a single African American was on the voter rolls. Even as late as 1960, more than 98% of Mississippi's Black adults were not registered to vote. Similarly, in 1953, in Alabama's so-called Black Belt, where the Black population equaled or exceeded that of whites, only 1.3% of eligible African Americans were registered. 2 counties had no Black voters whatsoever. In 1954, the year of Brown, the Alabama legislature modified the state's constitution to raise significantly the threshold on access to the polls by adding comprehensive understanding and good character clauses. Just as in Mississippi and Alabama, the disparity between white and Black adults with 5 years or less of education was so wide, 16.3% versus 54.1% respectively, that a requirement to read and interpret the state's constitution could yield only one result. Within 5 years, Black defiance, courage, and sheer will in the face of such impediments pushed that 1.3% registration percentage to a little over 5%. Yet by 1960, Wilcox and Lowndes counties, with more than 11,000 voting age African Americans, still had no registered Black voters, while in Bullock County, a mere 5 Blacks had registered out of a total of 4,450, or 0.1%. In Dallas County, with Selma as a major city, just 0.9% of eligible African Americans were registered to cast a vote or ballot. On the other hand, 6 Alabama counties in the Black Belt actually listed more than 100% of eligible whites registered to vote, with Lowndes County topping the list at 117.9%. States relied as well upon other mechanism of insidious discrimination to silence Blacks and ensure that the rule of a few would shape the course of the South and the nation for years to come. Legislative apportionment gave overwhelming and disproportionate power to rural counties, especially those that held the most ardent white segregationists and the largest Black populations outside the urban areas. For example, Alabama, up to the 1960s, used the census from 1900, when the state was overwhelmingly rural, to determine the number of representatives each county sent to the state legislature. The result was that growing urban centers like Birmingham were underrepresented, while Black Belt counties generally had twice as many legislators as their populations warranted. That disproportionate power was further aggravated by the massive disenfranchisement of the Black population. With cities thus electorally emasculated and Blacks in the rural counties silenced, there would be no countervailing force in the legislature to moderate or curtail the stranglehold at the State House. On May 31st, 1955, the Supreme Court handed down an implementation decision, Brown 2, stating that desegregation in public schools must happen with all deliberate speed. Recognizing that disenfranchisement and legislative apportionment would not be enough to stop the progress stemming from Brown, the Deep South and Virginia soon added to their arsenals the discredited legal hocus pocus of interposition, which argued that the state could put itself between federal law and U.S. citizens to stop enforcement of any ruling with which the state disagreed. State Representative Sam Engelhardt declared that interposition would serve notice on the rest of the nation that Alabama and the South will not accept integration. At a January 1956 meeting in Richmond, Georgia, Governor Marvin Griffin announced that the Southern leadership all by itself had determined that the federal courts did not have jurisdiction over any state of the Union, except in the case of suits between states respecting boundary disputes. Mississippi declared Brown, quote, unconstitutional and of no lawful effect within the territorial limits of the state of Mississippi, end quote. While South Carolina's new governor, George Bell Timmerman, endorsed a unanimous legislative resolution that, quote, condemns the illegal encroachment by the central government on the state's sovereignty. Just as at Fort Sumter at the start of the Civil War, the first shots were aimed at the federal government, which in the Southern states' view had no authority that they were bound to respect. Georgia's legislator even went so far as to pass a resolution to, quote, repeal the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America and to impeach the members of the Supreme Court, end quote. On July 1st, 1956, the state adopted a new flag designed by segregationist John Sammons Bell, which featured a prominent Confederate battle flag. It was Georgia's way of letting the NAACP and the rest of the nation know that white Georgians, once willing to die to protect slavery, were also willing to die to protect segregation. Meanwhile, white citizens' councils made up of the sort found at Rotary meetings or dancing at the country club sprang up throughout the South with but one objective: destroy Brown. The Texas White Citizens Council issued the disclaimer, quote, we do not advocate violence or any form of illegal activity, end quote. But the organization vowed to, quote, prevent the integration of Negroes into white schools and do so by any means at its command which falls within the law, end quote. The Texas Council therefore proposed an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would require the Supreme Court to answer to Congress. First, this would, by design, destroy the central concept of checks and balances in the Constitution. Second, the proposed amendment would also ensure that the Supreme Court, given the stranglehold that Southern Democrats had on both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, would be at Dixie's beck and call. And in Louisiana, the governor empowered state police to arrest any federal judge or U.S. Marshal who tried to implement Brown. The so-called Southern Manifesto, however, was the shot heard round America. On March 12, 1956, Representative Howard Smith, a Democrat from Virginia, and Senator Walter George, a Democrat from Georgia, introduced the Declaration of Constitutional Principles before their respective chambers in Congress, asserting that the Supreme Court had violated states' rights, abused judicial authority, and undercut the separation of powers. Signed by 101 members of Congress, all from the states of the old Confederacy, Senator Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat from Texas, was one of only a handful of holdouts. The Southern Manifesto signaled to their constituencies that massive resistance to Brown was not some base, primeval white supremacy, but rather a principled patriotic stand to defend the Constitution. The Southern Manifesto gave sanction from the highest levels to use the levers of government to defy the U.S. Supreme Court until, with the federal judiciary and African Americans tiring of the fight, Brown simply collapsed. Their goal was just to fight until people gave up. The game plan of stall and defy was now in place. Southern states used and abused the legal process to pass one unconstitutional law after the next, knowing that the process to overturn the statutes would be costly. We might as well be candid, Georgia Attorney General Eugene Cook admitted. Most of the laws will be stricken down by the courts in due course. But in the meantime, all the motions, hearings, affidavits, rulings, and appeals kept Brown at bay. Those extended legal battles allowed year after year to drizzle by, while the continued existence of separate and decidedly unequal schools consigned Black children to some of the worst education that America had to offer. Proud of the consequences, one man bragged, quote, as long as we can legislate, we can segregate, end quote. Indeed, by 1963, not one Black child attended a public school with a white child in South Carolina, Alabama, or Mississippi. In Virginia, the birthplace of massive resistance, a full decade after Brown, only 1.63% of Blacks were attending desegregated schools. In North Carolina, generally billed as having a, quote, more genteel, end quote, Jim Crow, fewer than 1% of Black pupils in the state attended school with whites. African American students who once saw in Brown their, quote, opportunity to step forward and prove to the world that the Negro is as capable as any human being, end quote, now saw the lives and futures of nearly 2.7 million Black children hanging precariously in legal purgatory in the old Confederacy. African Americans faced a Hobson's choice: back down and accept the inferior, unequal, and unconstitutional education that states insisted Black children deserved, or call the South's bluff and risk no public schools at all. Black parents chose to fight and hauled the states back to court. Arkansas became the site of a landmark lawsuit and the U.S. Supreme Court decision. African Americans were furious at how Little Rock, with a district judge's approval, shut down the city's schools after, quote, violence and disorder, end quote, caused by the actions of the governor and legislator rained down on 9 Black teenagers. The subsequent U.S. Supreme Court decision in Cooper versus Aaron was unequivocal. Brown was, quote, was a supreme law of the land and had to be obeyed, end quote. The state could not deprive Black children of their constitutional rights in the face of the violence and disorder that the state had brought upon itself. But that ruling, like Brown, only baited white officials in the South. In an amazingly wrong-headed interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, Arkansas argued that it was the state's governor, not the U.S. Supreme Court, who had the right and power to determine the law of the land. With Governor Orville Faubus, quote, doing just about everything he could to secede from the Union, end quote, Roy Wilkins defined it as an insurrection. Faubus's Fort Sumter moment happened the minute the governor closed the public schools in Little Rock, and all legislative machinery of privatization that had been previously holstered came out blazing. Between donations totaling more than $300,000, state funding of $176 per year per student, and taxpayer-subsidized busing to private academies, goodness, Little Rock had the means for most white children to remain in school, while the state simultaneously defied the Supreme Court by keeping Blacks locked out. As one white student recalled, quote, when they said there was going to be a private school and that it would not cost you anything, my parents said, you're going, end quote. As a disconsolate, Wilkins understood, though, while white parents sent their children to private academies funded by the state, we had no such recourse. Black children in Little Rock were without school altogether. Delaware had witnessed the first act of massive resistance to Brown in the town of Milford, where approximately 1,500 people descended on the high school shouting, quote, keep our schools white and dynamite the schools. Remember that, dynamite the schools. We're going to come back to that. A subsequent district court ruling snubbed both the landmark 1954 decision and Cooper versus Aaron by authorizing a 12-year delay in implementing Brown, or essentially another complete era of Black children in the swamp of Jim Crow education, despite the well-stated law of the land. At least implicitly, the federal judges conceded that white people's prejudices and lack of self-restraint were justification for continuing to deny Blacks their constitutional protections. In Virginia, when local school boards in Charlottesville, Norfolk, and Front Royal were under federal court orders to admit Black students, Governor James Lindsay Almond closed, in his words, every school threatened with desegregation. Ironically, because the white, well-funded schools in those cities matched that description, no one was clamoring to integrate overcrowded Moton High and Prince Edward County. He had shut out nearly 13,000 white children from getting an education. But despite their own actions in bringing Virginia to this point, Governor Almond and his supporters placed full blame for education disruption at the feet of the NAACP agitators. School closures spread now to besieged Prince Edward County. This time, Black children were in the crosshairs, where they would remain for nearly a generation. With Brown looming over their heads, Virginia's political officials passed a series of laws to close the public schools, siphon tax dollars into private academies, and pay tuition for white students, while ensuring that there was nothing in place for African American children to continue their education. On November 11, 1955, the Gray Commission, named after State Senator Garland Gray, rolled out a phalanx of recommendations to keep Virginia's schools separate and unequal. Gray first cherry-picked the commission's members, providing disproportionate representation to those in Black Belt counties, and then narrowed discussion even further by tapping only to the most ardent segregationists to sit on the all-important Executive Council. Another more moderate alternative, the Perot Plan, named for State Senator Mosby Perot, would have at least saved the public schools, but just barely. This plan developed a formula to divert the lion's share of tax dollars into a private school system while cutting public schools' funding and operational abilities to the bone. The governor shelved that one and eventually chose Gray's. The state of Virginia was hurtling toward an educational apocalypse. Since 1954, nearly 20% of the state's public schools had closed in response to Brown. Moreover, the Gray Plan required Virginia to spend $1 million for every 1% of the student population that chose the private school system. Savoring this Pyrrhic victory, State Senator Gray proudly boasted, "I guess we won the Civil War." The Gray Commission's plan was put into action after a 1959 Fourth Circuit decision reversed a district court ruling that had given Prince Edward County a full 7 years to comply with Brown. With the Fourth Circuit now ordering the schools to integrate by the fall of 1959, county supervisors immediately abolished the property tax that funded public schools and diverted the money into a cash for tuition grants to support the all-white Prince Edward Academy. The supervisors added their county funds to grants offered by the state to ensure that the costs for this private education were covered with public dollars. In addition, 67 of the 69 teachers at Prince Edward Academy were all from now closed public schools. While white children educated, 2,700 Black children were locked out. The defiance of Prince Edward County was singular. No other school system in that nation remained closed for 5 years, 1959 to 1964, rather than comply with Brown. The impoverished but determined African American community managed to send some children away to relatives, but only 35 Black students were able to attend those out-of-state schools on a full-time basis. During those 5 long years, critical in terms of child development, most African American students spent their formative education time in activity centers that the Black community cobbled together. The Baltimore Afro-American reported that these makeshift centers, some in basements, some in churches, others in abandoned shacks, staffed overwhelmingly by housewives and those with only a high school diploma, could not provide anything approximating an adequate education. The resources were simply not available to be open more than 3 days a week for half a day and have a curriculum of, quote, little more than a scant program of reading, singing, and discussion. These years had taken a great toll on the children. Once again, Black parents with the determined Reverend L. Francis Griffin as a plaintiff had to haul Virginia back to court. But as a Washington Post reported, when the lawsuits hit, Prince Edward's County supervisors simply, quote, denied that the Virginia Constitution requires the operation of public schools in any county, end quote. Finally, cutting through that absurdity, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down 2 unequivocal decisions that forced the schools to reopen. Even then, local and state authorities employed every weapon in their arsenal to ensure that the newly reopened system remained segregated, impoverished, and academically substandard. The most popular method of foot dragging was the school board's Freedom of Choice plan, which ensured that white students could move their children away from any school threatened with desegregation. The result was that by 1969, Prince Edward County schools were now 98% Black and once again starved of resources. Stall and defy had transformed into stall and undermine, but the results were the same: devastating. During the series of court cases swirling around Prince Edward County, a judge had noted that an interrupted education of 1 year or even 6 months at that age places a serious handicap upon a child, which the average one may not overcome. The federal government agreed, and in 1963 backed the privately funded free school to serve as an educational bridge to get the Black children of Prince Edward County academically ready for when the public schools finally reopened. But it was too late. One Black teen, Skip Griffin, spoke of how embarrassing it was to sit in a classroom and look at an assignment, unable to do anything more than write his name at the top of a page. He had two crippling words to describe himself: very dumb. His mother had tried to help him, but the schools she herself had attended in Prince Edward County were nothing but shanties and hovels with the equipment to match. The psychological devastation was equally debilitating. Henry Cabarrus recalled one of the Prince Edward County's white officials declaring that he would rather his children be baked in the oven than go to an integrated school. Cabarrus was taken aback. When you have such strong white resistance against you as a person, such that they can take away the most fundamental thing, education, if someone can take that from you, your esteem is so small that you're always looking over your shoulder for who is going to attack or criticize. The damage had been done. Eventually, Skip Griffin, along with the legions of African American children, became discouraged and simply dropped out. Prince Edward County is emblematic of the way that the systemized racism not only destroys Black lives, but also undermines the very strength of the United States. Even as thousands of African American children were left behind educationally, the economy was beginning a seismic transformation that would require even more of its citizens. Factory jobs, the one that President Franklin Roosevelt had once called, quote, the arsenal of democracy, end quote, the living wage with barely a high school diploma jobs, were rapidly disappearing. It wasn't quite perceptible then that a sector that at one time had accounted for some 25% of all paid employment in the United States would be near collapse by the 1970s. But the first cracks in the armor of industrial America were already there in the 1950s. By the time Prince Edward County finally decided to implement at least parts of Brown in the 1970s, the heyday of industrial America, where gainful employment had not required a strong education, just a strong back, was already well over, with the knowledge-based economy taking hold. That economy was primed for those who had the benefit of years of good schools, and in particular, for whites who had a well-funded public school system that went all the way through the 12th grade and graduated the lion's share of them as college ready. By contrast, an entire generation of Black children who had fought long and hard to receive a quality education was now forced to face this cold, hard new economy with neither the necessary education nor work skills. It was not just Black America, however, that suffered the cost of this waste of human lives and talent. The brutally relentless tactics of Stalin defy, then Stalin undermine, tactics that went on for at least 4 decades, left the United States with millions of citizens who lacked the education needed to be competitive in a global, technology-driven economy. This, in turn, left the United States lagging far behind other developed countries and placed the nation at enormous economic risk. We're going to stop there. That's page 87. I feel like I repeat the same thing every week that we talk about this, but it bears repeating. It's repeating itself. The fact that they were willing to shut down and demolish schools to ensure that Black students would not have an education with white students is the epitome of burning it all down to spite one particular group. If we think about what's currently happening in Palestine, the way that all of Gaza is being targeted as a response to one group, it leans into that. When we think about how now the way that trade jobs are frowned upon and people are sneered at for working a trade job, meanwhile, that was what was keeping the economy going, but it became frowned upon because of a lack of education. But the lack of education came from keeping education from Black students. This is when I say, and I have said this and other people have said this, white supremacy affects everybody. The target may be for people that are not cis het white rich men, but it still affects everybody. You cannot cause that much oppression to one group and expect it not to trickle out to other places because that one group is not isolated. You can try for segregation. They tried for segregation, but they still lived amongst white people. Black people still lived amongst white people, which meant that that destruction, that oppression was going to trickle over to white people eventually. Liberation, the act of liberation it's liberation for all of us. It is not liberation for just one group. And so reading this book and thinking about what's happening today, thinking about myself as a Black person, thinking about other marginalized identities, it can be easy to fight for just your group, just your marginalized identity. But that does not do anything for liberation, and it does not do anything to help anything as a whole, which means that the oppression that you've been fighting so hard against and to rise above will still come back to you in some other way. It has to be a fight for true liberation. I mentioned on a video the other day that I am angry most of the time, and I am with what's happening in the state of the world, not just Palestine, but Congo and Sudan and other places globally. And so the journal prompt that I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you two. I want you to continue to think about the ways that history is continuing itself. I want you to think about the ways in which you have seen white supremacy trickle out beyond the intended target. And I also want you to think about what you're doing to take care of yourself while we are living through some of the most violent times in our lifetimes. Are you eating? Are you drinking water? Are you trying to sleep? Are you taking the time to uplift the voices of other people? Are you not stopping the work, but maybe shielding yourself from some of the more violent things at times, but also not looking away? There's a difference between catching your breath and fully turning your back. Catching our breath is what's needed. We're going to stop there. This book is, it could be a book that was written last year. And I really want to thank you all for going on this journey with me. We are really just starting, but it's timely. And it's important to see, again, how history is right here in our faces. And nothing changes until nothing changes. I will see you all next week with the continuation of Chapter 3. Make sure that you all taking care of yourselves. We'll see you soon.